All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all again, for those who have met before, and if you haven't met before, so it's nice to meet you. My name's Peter Harrison. I'm a scholar from the University of Queensland. I've just submitted my PhD thesis, thankfully, a couple weeks ago, so I'm going to present my findings from that project now. And the project's on the short-term effects of low-volume resistance exercise, and basically the question I've been trying to answer the last few years is, can resistance exercise priming improve performance in athletes? Before I go too much further in terms of priming or what exercise priming is, the definition, I guess, of priming itself is just to prepare something for use or action. So when we're talking about exercise priming or priming exercise strategies, what I'm really referring to is just a prior exercise stimulus, which prepares athletes for subsequent action. And basically my thesis consisted of 6 chapters, so literature review, and then I conducted a survey of practitioners, which thankfully QS helped me out with sending that out to a few of the coaches in the national network, so that was good to get. And then we conducted a series of randomized control trials. So we did 4 control trials examining various exercise stimuli. So I'll come back throughout those. I'll try and keep it as brief as I can, but I will try and go through some of the findings from those studies. From the review of the literature, basically, we found that there were a range of priming exercise which has been shown to influence performance for up to 48 hours subsequently. And obviously that's it's an awkward cutoff period. It's probably studies which have found benefits after longer periods and also shorter periods, but that was generally was within sort of 2 days, which most of the research has found that priming exercise was beneficial. And there'd been various exercise stimuli which have been shown to result in these improvements. So there was a few resistance exercise protocols in particular, but also some other exercise methods like cycling and also sprint priming as well. So from our literature review, we clicker stop working. I think maybe I click. It might be. If I click back in the presentation, but you click on the slide itself.
I just had to admit something.
No,
sorry.
So most of the studies actually examined resistance exercise protocols, so it kind of gave us the most to work with. There's only a couple of studies that looked at sprinting or cycling priming exercises. And most of the resistance exercise studies had shown some sort of benefits to some generally strength and power measures of performance, so things like sprinting, jumping, and also strength measures. I guess one theme which was consistent throughout was that generally the high load exercise strategies tended to be effective or appeared effective from those studies. But again, because of the limited literature, it was quite difficult to discern which were the most effective protocols, and also what the effects might be from other exercise methods. When we sort of put together the limited research which existed a few years ago, we sort of had 2 little areas of where we found performance improvements. So one was between 4 and 6 hours after resistance exercise stimuli. And then some studies had also looked at it some later time, so up to 48 hours, but also the day after, which was 24 to 33 hours after the exercise. And we basically put together this little model of what we thought might occur after one priming stimulus. But none of these studies examined the time course or the time kinetics of the responses. So this is purely hypothetical. We're saying if we saw improvements at 4 hours, then maybe we also see improvements at 24 hours. But that was certainly one thing which we highlighted, which would be good to look at.
There was no negative effect?
All these studies which are shown here in this figure were the ones that showed improvements. There's probably a couple other studies which showed no performance improvements. None reported negative effects, but it's not to say that no one's ever found that there have been negative effects. So in terms of what we didn't know, though, we certainly didn't know if exercise was being if priming exercise were being prescribed by coaches, and if so, what kind of methods were they using? So that was going to be really helpful for us to find out. And because of limited studies, there was really no consistent approach in how the investigators had sort of examined performance. So one study, for example, looked at counter jump peak power, another study looked at 3RM squat strength, another looked at sprinting, and we kind of put all these together in the same basket, whereas they're actually measuring completely different things. So that was another thing which we highlighted in our literature review. And there was really limited evidence for other loading methods, apart from 3 or 4 studies which looked at high load strength training. There was limited evidence for moderate loads and whether they could also be effective, or perhaps some low load or unloaded jumping as well. And as I mentioned previously, there was really limited knowledge of the time course of responses. So I guess all of those gaps in literature provided a bit of a foundation or direction for where the project was going to go. And directed the subsequent studies. So the first study we did was the survey of practitioners, and the objective of this was really just to explore if coaches were prescribing priming exercise, and if they were, then what were the methods used, what kind of exercise, and what timing were we talking about. To make it easier for, to clearly define what we meant by priming exercise for this survey, we described in the survey that it was any exercise prescribed within 48 hours of sporting competition, but to acutely enhance performance competition. So it couldn't just be any type of exercise. We're really interested for the coaches who said, actually, we're prescribing this because I think it helps our athletes on competition day. And the key findings were that just over half of that practitioners, so I think it was 52%, prescribed some form of priming exercise within that period of 48 hours. We collected data from a range of practitioners working in a range of sports and also multi-sport coaches. And there was no real, we conducted an analysis of whether there was a difference between any sports that coaches really commonly prescribe priming exercise, but there was really no trend there. What was interesting though, that even for the coaches, so the roughly 50% of coaches who were prescribing these strategies, they certainly didn't always prescribe them. So as you can see in the graph on the right, some of them, or only some of them, prescribed it always, and then the majority of the others prescribed it, almost always or on occasions. In terms of the methods that coaches prescribed, there were both upper and lower body exercises. And generally 2 to 3 sets of 3 to 5 repetitions. So obviously quite a low volume of resistance exercise if you're talking about a normal strength power training session. It's quite a low volume. But then in terms of the other methods such as loading and also the exercise selection, there was a massive range used by coaches. I've just highlighted some of the most commonly prescribed ones. So a lot of coaches tended to prescribe unloaded jumps in their sessions, but also mix that with some loaded squats, being usually partial squats, or some loaded jumps. And then traditionally, when it was upper body exercise, it was a traditional strength power lifts like your bench press, chin up, and bench pull. For the exercise loading, as you can see, there was a massive range. So only some coaches prescribed heavy strength training, which we defined as 85% or above in terms of 1RM. And that was interesting for us because most of the literature showing that there were benefits from priming actually said that it was a heavy loaded stimulus which was effective. So yeah, that gave us a little bit more direction as well. In terms of timing, there was a range of timing prescribed, but the most common time that coaches prescribed it was within 8 hours of competition. So generally a morning exercise session prior to an afternoon or evening competition. So in terms of the implications from this, I guess there was many gaps in the literature, and it gave us really quite a lot that we could look at, but there were certainly a few questions in particular that we still wanted to answer. And there was certainly limited evidence for a lot of the strategies which were being prescribed in practice. So the first control trial study that we examined was we wanted to have a look at the effects of high load strength training. And we also wanted to examine whether a moderate load exercise could get the same, or if a moderate load stimulus could get the same responses. So whether we really did have to load our athletes with heavy strength exercise. We also wanted to examine the time course. So studies had shown that 4 to 6 hours after the heavy strength training, there were improvements there, but we didn't really know what would happen afterwards. And I think only one other study had examined the moderate load exercise, so we weren't too sure what was going to happen after that. The methods we used, it was a randomised and counterbalanced control trial with repeated measures design, and we recruited 15 trained, recreationally trained males, and that's what the study timeline looked like. So each participant completed a control, a high load, and also a moderate load trial. Before each of those, we conducted baseline testing, and then after that, we conducted testing again 5 minutes after the exercise, again in the afternoon, which was 8 hours after, and then the participants came back on 2 occasions the next day at 24 and 32 hours after. In terms of our testing, what we wanted to do with our counter movement jump and squat jump measures was, one, get an idea of what happened to jump output, so jump height, but also mainly we wanted to look at the force time characteristics, so whether the athletes could produce more force in less time, or whether there were any changes in depth or the strategy of the jump, and also the temporal or time measures of that jump. As I mentioned before, the studies previously which had examined jump measures had only really told us about jump output, and also I think one looked at counter movement jump peak power. And in terms of understanding really what's happening in terms of the responses, it's much better to try and have an overall picture of output, but also what happens to force and time. We also collected saliva on each of these occasions to get an idea of salivary hormone responses. There was some suggestion from the early literature that perhaps testosterone and cortisol responses would be central, or perhaps might be an indicator of the performance responses after priming or other exercise interventions. And we also want to get an idea of the perceptual responses. So even if maybe we were getting a 3 or 4% increase in jump height or muscular performance, for me or for us, it was really important to try and understand how athletes were feeling in terms of overall, do you feel better or ready to perform, and soreness and a couple other of those measures. And again, by collecting data on those 4 occasions, we wanted to create the time kinetics of each of those responses. In terms of results, so after the high load exercise, we found that squat jump height was improved 8 hours after. So it was highlighted in the graph on the right, that squat jump output. There was very limited change to the force time characteristics of the squat jump, but there were some small effect size changes to braking and also propulsive force at that time after the high load exercise. So output improved, but there was, I guess, limited change to the force time characteristics after the heavy load squats. After the moderate load squats, we actually found that the most beneficial results occurred 32 hours after the moderate load squats, and that was the day after, in the afternoon, where jump height improved in both the squat jump and the counter movement jump. But in addition to that, there was an improvement in the force time characteristics. So not only did jump output improve, but there was an increase in the force output, and the athletes jumped in less time. So if you hear about things like reactive strength index or RSI modifier, that's the kind of measure that we're looking at there. So there's an improvement in both jump height and force time characteristics, only at that time, which was 32 hours after the moderate load squats. Interestingly, we actually also found that after the control trial, we also saw some improvements in jump output of both the squat jump and counter movement jump, but really limited change in the force time characteristics. So there was only an output change, which probably suggests that the athletes adapted a little bit throughout the 4 or 5 repeated jumps. When you look at perhaps why that happens, after completing the baseline 5-minute, 8-hour, 24 and 32-hour jumps, the athletes or the participants completed a total of over 40 maximal unloaded jumps. So potentially that influenced the performance later on. So yeah, obviously it wasn't something that we were expecting to see, but that was interesting nonetheless, and something that gave us some direction for the next study. In terms of the endocrine response, there was really no clear differences or trends between control, high load or moderate load responses. What we did notice was there was an anticipatory increase. So at the baseline level, there was an increase in testosterone or saliva testosterone before the participants did the high load squats and also the moderate load squats, which made things really difficult to analyse, because when we normalise those, the graph on the right actually shows that the testosterone was relatively lower after the priming exercises. But what we did was, when we used the control baseline groups for all, control baseline values for all groups, there was actually no difference between any of the groups if there wasn't that initial anticipatory increase in testosterone. In terms of perceptual responses, there was a few changes which actually coincided with the changes we saw in muscular performance. So when we asked participants overall physically, how are you feeling? There was an improvement at 8 hours after the high load squats. There was also an improvement both 32 hours after the moderate load and the control activities. So there were small to moderate effect size increases at those times. But what we did see is, after the high load squats, even though they improved psychophysiological measures on the day of, on the morning after, which was 24 hours after, there was actually some increases in perceived fatigue and also some decreases in physical performance ratings, or perceived physical performance ratings. So potentially giving us some guidance in terms of maybe high load exercise might be beneficial on the day of completion, but should be reconsidered or maybe considered not to be used the day before subsequent action, whether that be training or competition. In terms of some other applications, so there were generally quite small changes to both muscular and perceptual state following the priming exercise. But there were improved responses 8 hours after the high load squats, which were performed at up to 87% of 1RM, and the day after, which was in the afternoon, following completing the moderate load squats at 65% of 1RM. The time course, importantly, appeared to change depending on the stimulus. So practitioners who are prescribing different types of loading, I guess now have some more direction in terms of perhaps when the best time is to prescribe that exercise, or if practitioners are time bound and they need to prescribe an activity only at a given time, then perhaps there's some more direction in terms of what kind of stimulus that they can use. And lastly, because of the response we found after the control was potentially an unloaded jumping exercise or series of unloaded jumping bouts, might influence subsequent performance on the following day. So that was something we wanted to look at for the next study. So that's what we did. We conducted another study, and we wanted to examine the effects of the repeated counter movement jump and squat jump testing, which we completed in the control trial. So the objectives, apart from that, were also to examine the diurnal changes between morning and afternoon. And to do that, instead of conducting performance in the morning and then the repeated measures in the afternoon after, we also conducted an additional rested baseline in the afternoon to compare rested morning and rested afternoon performance. We also wanted to examine the effects of individual characteristics by using jump output as an indicator of physical characteristics. And also, we collected data from both 14 males and 14 recreationally trained females for the study. In terms of the diurnal changes, we saw no changes to any of the counter movement jump metrics, and some trivial but also some small changes to squat jump metrics. So that provided, I guess, a little bit of direction for why all the changes we saw in some squat jump outcomes. In terms of the effects of the repeated jump testing, when we analysed all 14 male participants and all 14 female participants together, we pretty much saw no effect of the repeated jumping testing at all. But when we analysed them differently and broke them into two groups based off jump output, that's where we actually saw quite different responses between the more athletic compared to the less athletic individuals, which were divided by jump height. So both our male and female participants tended to respond better to the repeated jumping testing after they completed the repeated jumps. So the high jump output individuals performed better during the repeated jumps, and the lower jump output or less athletic individuals actually tended to get worse throughout those repeated jump tests. And that more or less actually replicated or sort of replicated the findings that we found in our initial study where those jump outcomes were improved at the 32-hour time point. So in terms of practical applications, there were trivial to small diurnal changes between morning and afternoon performance for some squat jump metrics, and bouts of unloaded jumping may act as a positive stimulus for athletic individuals. In comparison, the less athletic individuals didn't respond well to the repeated jumps, and potentially that would provide some indication that for other exercise methods like resistance exercise or sprinting, that might not be a positive or might not result in a positive outcome for those who are lesser trained. So to our community sport athletes, prescribing and priming the day before on a Friday might not be the best idea, which might not be surprising, but I guess it's a small or first bit of indication that might actually be the case. And lastly, very limited studies had previously looked at any priming exercise strategies in female athletes. So this data, even though it was really limited, I guess is our first suggestion that, okay, maybe we can prescribe similar strategies for both male and female athletes if they're athletic and have the training background to do so. The next study, we wanted to examine some different priming exercises. So there've been quite a few studies that examined high loads, and we also examined moderate load in our first control trial. We also wanted to examine the effects of a low-loaded jumping stimulus. And the other idea we had was a maximal isometric exercise. And to see whether those could also be effective. To do this, we conducted again another randomised control trial with 15 trained males. The difference is in this study, the design between the first one, we didn't do a repeated test, so it was only one test after each of the protocols. So for control, we tested only 3 hours after a standardised warm-up. For the low load, we tested either 3 hours or 27 hours after the squat jumps, which were loaded with 20% of 1RM. And then for the isometric squat, we set up a isometric half squat, and the contractions were 4 sets of 3-second maximal contractions in that half squat position. Findings here were quite limited. So we had no changes to counter movement jump output or isometric mid-thigh pull output. But we did find some small changes to force time characteristics only 3 hours after the low load priming exercise, where there was a small decrease in propulsive duration, and the jump height by contraction time, or RSR modified, was improved slightly at that 3 hour time point only. There were also positive or small positive changes to perceptual state 3 hours after both the low load and isometric activities, and that's shown on the graph on the bottom right, whereas there was actually negative responses on the day after the low load squat jumps. So again, some evidence of there might be some fatiguing responses occurring after low load jumps, and also the high load activity, which we prescribed in the first study. So the practical applications, there were limited changes, particularly compared to the high and moderate load squat exercises that we used, but some further direction for some coaches who were prescribing loaded jumping activities. The last study we wanted to look at was examining the effects of an upper body priming exercise. So because of the positive results we found after moderate load half squats, we wanted to see whether a moderate load upper body activity would also be beneficial, which was completed at 65% of 1RM. So the priming activity involved both the bench press and bench pull, completed at 65% of 1RM. And this study, even though I'm presenting it last week, completed, I think, after our second study. So we haven't quite caught on that the testing measures perhaps might influence subsequent testing. So as you can see, we did complete the testing in a repeated testing design. So we got the participants to come in to complete the control, which was no exercise, or the priming activity, which is the moderate load upper body priming activity. 3 hours after we completed a maximal bench throw, to record peak velocity of that, and also the bench pull. And they were performed at 25%, 50% and 75% of 1RM to try and get an idea of the load velocity responses that we get and whether perhaps the responses following priming might be specific to the load prescribed. In terms of the findings, again, we found quite trivial changes to upper body performance. There was no effect size changes 3 or 27 hours after priming, apart from the bench pull testing at 50% of 1RM, which was a small effect size change. So this is perhaps because of the different, although we prescribed using 1RM loading, the bench pull with 65% of 1RM can be completed at a much higher velocity than the bench press. And in addition, the bench press, there's a deceleration involved because we didn't let the participants let go of the bar. So they probably couldn't maximally accelerate that bench press activity. Again, it's not something we looked at directly, but it potentially is something to look at in the future, whether maximally accelerating a barbell or throughout a movement might have something to do with the responses afterwards. We also saw some improvements to perceptual responses both 3 and 27 hours after the priming. But again, because of the limited responses with sort of physical responses, it's I guess leaves, there wasn't a lot which we took from that priming exercise. So overall, there was limited change following the moderate load upper body exercise, but potentially it provide indication that intent or acceleration throughout a movement might be important to consider for prescribing priming strategies. So that was the last of our studies. I was just putting together quick little conclusions and practical applications to try and bring it back to the first slide of what we tried to answer. So firstly, in terms of the anecdotal evidence of if and how priming exercise was prescribed, we learned that quite a few coaches were prescribing these sort of strategies with their athletes, and that a range of priming activities are prescribed. So it certainly didn't follow any, not every practitioner was doing the exact same priming methods. There was only a limited number of studies, and there still is. Research is still quite limited, but I guess with our lower body randomized control trials and using the same counter movement jump metrics, we provided some more evidence that in some occasions that there are small positive changes to both muscular and perceptual responses after priming exercise. In terms of the time course of responses, I think some important findings there, just with some indications that our low load and high load exercise activities for some reason were more effective on the day of their completion, but actually showed some fatiguing responses on the day after. And that might be because of the eccentric or the muscular loading involved in both of those. Even with the low load is landing those squat jumps because they're loaded with such a light weight, the athletes tended to still be able to jump quite high. So maybe that's why we saw some fatiguing responses on the day after. Whereas following our moderate load squats and unloaded jumping activities, we also saw some improvements on the day after, which was 32 hours after. And then in terms of the last couple, there were limited evidence for other loading methods apart from high load squats. So in terms of our results, we found that quite limited changes occurred after the low load jumps, and we found no effect size changes at all following the isometric squatting exercises. There were limited but some positive changes to the force time characteristics after the low load jumping protocol. Although, as mentioned before, there were some negative perceptual responses on the day after. In terms of the upper body exercise, there are mostly trivial changes to bench throw velocity after our moderate load priming exercise, but we did find the isolated improvement to bench pull velocity, which perhaps gives some direction for further research in sports such as kayaking, rowing and so on, which involves that type of movement. Lastly, there was limited knowledge of the endocrine responses and perhaps if that was related to the physical or perceptual responses, but we found no clear changes in the one study where we collect saliva for those measures. So the indication from our results was that it might not be essential to either physical nor perceptual changes following priming exercise. In terms of the final practical applications, sticking with the big rocks first, I think as physical performance practitioners, there are some minor changes that can occur following priming exercise. There are some opportunities to augment aspects of performance, but it's probably one of the, perhaps on top of getting your general training and training methodologies right, then we can start thinking about some activities which can prime or even further prepare our athletes for competition or training. In terms of different tools or exercise methods that we can use, we try to isolate the squat exercise or squat-based exercises in our thesis, but we might get similar benefits following similar exercises. So it might be a step up, it might be clean pulls or other Olympic derivatives, which might also be effective. But certainly we did find that some methods were more effective than others, and that loading did certainly play a role in that. So considering the loading and maybe the velocity of exercises that are being prescribed might be important for practitioners. And also the time course of responses needs to be considered, not only in terms of the priming prior to subsequent activities, but also timing of other training and exercise stimuli. So in all of our studies being controlled trials, we had a period of 2 to 3 days where the athletes weren't supposed to, they didn't complete any resistance training beforehand. Whereas in practice, depending on the methods and the schedule of the training, our athletes might be training, up to 2 or even 1 day prior to competition. Lastly, there was evidence, I guess, consistently that there were some psychophysiological benefits from the priming exercise. So on top of being some small physical benefits, is the psychophysiological benefit of the athletes just feeling a little bit more prepared potentially also important for us to consider? That's certainly something which might be looked at later down the line. And then also to compare it to other technical and tactical priming strategies, like teams will have their team talk just prior to competing, or it might be looking at some vision. So this type of physical priming, even though it might not be traditionally done, it might become something which we can think about a little bit more in terms of prescribing physical exercise to augment performance for our athletes. And the very last one we've got there is that the potential long-term effects of if we change, I guess, the way we think about priming and not necessarily thinking about it as simply something to prescribe before competition, but if we can just find a way to restructure our strength and power training stimuli, we might be able to get obviously long-term benefits, but some small benefits to really try and augment our athletes for each training session that they complete. And if we can make our athletes 2 or 3% more ready to complete training and then competition, after weeks and months of completing that, perhaps that benefit might be more than simply trying to get an extra 2 or 3% out of an athlete in one competition. Sweet, thank you very much for listening, and thanks again thank you of course to QS Spike and also the University of Queensland for supporting the research and my supervisory team. So Dr. Vince Kelly, Locke James, Mike McGuigan, Dave Jenkins, and Mark Connie. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well done.
Thanks, guys. Any questions at all online or here? Huge project. Yeah,
The students just kept going, like, what?
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep it short, but
No.
I never got short.
One question I had was, in your first study when you got data from practitioners,
Yep.
Did you get any data around why they decided whether or not to do priming, or why they decided to do a certain load, or
we didn't
another?
Yeah, so we didn't ask not about the methods they used. We never asked why do you use high load or unloaded jumps, for example. But what we did was just one general question was, why do you think that priming helps your athletes? So the general responses were they were pretty mixed, but some of them were just to make them feel better. Some of them were recovery related. So I actually thought it was more about recovering and getting the athletes moving to recover from their prior training. And then some counter to that, some of the reasons that practitioners didn't prescribe it. A few mentioned education. And a couple also mentioned athletes didn't enjoy the idea, or they didn't like the feeling of it. So yeah, I didn't actually include the data in there, but we did.
That's good. It was interesting to see as well that the difference between the practitioner's perspective of high load priming versus what the literature was actually saying.
Yeah, no, and that was something we were interested in as well, because from just having spoken to some practitioners, they were quite averse to prescribing those high loads so close to competition, which made sense, which was kind of what led us to looking at, okay, well, if practitioners wouldn't prescribe high loads, then what other stimuli can we look at?
I've got, it's not really a question, it's more of an observation. But I really like how you looked at the time course of the responses, and it was interesting that different types of priming were more effective, for different time points. So if you're an athlete or a team that's on the road and you might not have access to the facilities 8 hours before, if it's an away game or competition, that you've then got, something in your toolbox that you can do, 32 hours before or whatever, so I thought that was really good. And I guess there is a question around were the practices that you surveyed in keeping with what you found, and if not, how would you go about kind of translating your findings into practice and changing what they might be doing?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I guess that was what we wanted to create a picture of what what coaches were happy to prescribe or what they were currently prescribing. And then none of our studies were sort of to say, actually, you're doing the wrong thing, but we were just interested to say, okay, well, perhaps why have you got the idea that might be beneficial? So one, to answer the first question, is they were quite divergent, I think, particularly with most studies having evidence for the high load strategies, whereas only, I think, 20% of the practitioners prescribed those types of activities. But I think a lot of it's around, one, the limited research, even though it's only 3 or 4 studies which have looked at it before, and they're in quite strength-trained populations. So the studies which looked at those early results were generally semi-professional or professional rugby teams from Europe. So had a lot of strength training background. So I guess even though that our studies recruited pretty much highly but recreationally highly trained individuals, provides an indication of, maybe it can still be effective for those who aren't purely strength power trained. And yeah, hopefully some of the findings can be translated into practice. And I guess the more we can get out there and start creating more conversations with coaches about, okay, well, we found this now, is that something which you might consider in your training context? And that would be, I guess that's where it goes from there.
Yeah. Other questions?
In study 3, when you split the athlete groups into the ones you categorised as better, was that purely based on the jump performance, or was that based on training load, training experience?
Purely jump height. So it was just the 7 highest jump output and 7 lowest jump output. Yeah.
Did you have, or do you have any information on whether or not that's because they were more well trained, because they were resistance trained, or?
We did. So we asked those questions. We never ran an analysis of that though. So it was one of those things where we wanted to create, I guess, some measure of training or athletic status, but that was the one we chose. And I probably could go through the next few months and have a look at some of those other potential factors, which honestly would be good.
Was there much difference in the sort of anthropometric data on those athletes? If you had like a really tall person versus a really short person? No.
So the one thing that jumps out, not anthropometric, but we had one really well strength athlete, and his 1 round full squat was about 220 kilograms, which I guess for recreational is very strong. So when we did his high load priming, he did it at 190 plus kilos, and he had terrible performance responses. So that's, I guess, in terms of applying that in a strength setting, that was certainly one thing which sticks out. But no, nothing in terms of anthropometrics, so height or weight.
Do you have any questions online?
Yeah, I've got one. I was just wondering about the way that you differentiated the high performing from the lower performing athletes was just based on their jump heights. Is that correct? Yeah. So
That's right.
could that suggest that there's actually like a difference in fiber type composition, that, you know, people with more fast twitch fibers might be more responsive to?
Yeah, I had about 2 sentences in my general discussion for that, Alan. And so there has been a study which has looked at squat jump height and fiber type composition. So I think potentially, but I guess, you know, the strength of what we examined in that study was only 7 participants for each group.
Yeah.
So I still look at that as more of a pilot study and maybe giving direction for another study to follow on. But it'll be super interesting. I got a biopsy myself, and I'd never do it to anyone else though, so I decided not to do that.
It would be, you know, quite interesting though, because like the fast twitch fibers, particularly what we used to call type 2B fibers, or 2A, that they actually have higher thresholds for recruitment. So, you know, like higher priming loads might be necessary with a group like that, or longer sessions to actually, you know, activate those fibers.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got some more data which we could potentially have a look at. So when we did the priming in the first study, when we did the high loads, we collected the velocity of the priming as well. So potentially that might be something we can look at as well. And you know, if the higher velocity movement movers actually responded better. So yeah, I guess along those lines as well. But yeah,
that'd be really interesting. Yeah,
100%. I won't participate, but I'd be happy to read it.
I've got a question online. It's Jen here. Sorry, I can't put my camera on because I'm actually traveling on the move at the moment. But if you can all hear me, I just wanted to comment back on the coaches, and this, I guess, is probably more heading towards that brief little mention that we said about possibly where this may go in trying to change some of the coach behaviours or their practice, if for a better term. And I guess I'm coming back to what I'm doing in my own space at the moment, working with coaches, and notoriously what we're finding is that to change coach behaviour can be challenging. You can tell a coach what the literature says, but if they're very stuck in their ways of where they've been successful and through their own experience of what they deem works, in quotation marks there, it's something which, is that something you've considered as you've worked through your literature and okay, this is what we've identified? If we wanted to then translate this into practice, have you thought of any initial ideas about how you may go about working with coaches in that space, or is that too soon? Obviously, I appreciate you've just submitted your thesis, so it might not be on your mind at the moment.
No, that's a great question. I've certainly thought about it. I don't know if I have the right answers for it, but yeah, I've thought about that. I think one of probably the best things that we can do maybe in future studies that's talking about like a scientific route to answering that question, or you know, there's obviously other methods as well. But a lot of coaches, from discussing their, I guess, philosophies and programs, the ones who are averse to prescribing these kinds of strategies are generally, it's not because they think, you know, it doesn't exist. They just think in their context, that in their training programs and I guess the timing around their other exercise stimuli, they just think that it probably wouldn't work in that situation. And I can completely see that. And I think some coaches also come back to these kind of studies and say, yeah, so your 15 participants just did nothing for 3 days or for 2 days, and then you prescribed these exercises. So probably the direction that I would take with it is trying to find a bit more of an ecological, you know, a better study design to make it a little bit more practical now that we do have a little bit more knowledge about what the potential responses are. So that might be prescribing, you know, a normal training week of other training activities, and then just playing with that final sort of stimulus before maybe a simulated competition. And I think that would be, maybe coaches would be more willing to, or those who aren't, willing to change, maybe that's something that might be able to be more insightful for those.
Yeah, and even possibly considering, so exploring using that capability, opportunity, motivation of coaches. And then something else we're finding is coaches often respond, and again, I appreciate I'm trying to translate just through what my own exposure with coaches at the moment in my PhD, and a lot of them are saying that sometimes leadership teams in sports and organisations often refer to coaches saying that they like to essentially feel like they've come up with the idea themselves, to sort of take a bit more ownership of their role. So I guess I'm just possibly providing you with something which may be something you can sit with for a while. It might be useful, it might not be, but so in essence what we're doing with coaches at the moment is working with some more interactive workshops and sort of interventions where you get the coaches to really kind of lead it, but you're guiding them into the outcome that you want. And I'm just wondering whether your research could translate in a similar way. I guess that's not a question. I guess that's just my take on that space of working with coaches.
Yeah, 100%. No, that's super valuable. Thanks for that as well.
Yeah, Jenna, I think that you've made a really good point there. And I think perhaps the point you made right at the end about it being kind of small changes in training that can actually have then a big effect. So when I think of priming, I always think about competition, but how can we actually manipulate that training week to get more out? So training, smarter, not harder. And maybe that then you could use as a bit of a vehicle if you're having a conversation with a coach to be like, well, how can we get more out of this athlete? Oh, well, we could try just changing this session around, doing this here. And then all of a sudden you get your buy-in that way. And then it's like, oh, why don't we try this before competition? So I think like having that almost double whammy of potential situations where this might help might give you a good vehicle for, like Jen was saying, just sowing the seed really and helping the coaches to get on board with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions online?
Yeah, I was just to follow up on, I'll make myself visible.
Oh, we haven't got you on the screen for some reason.
Just a follow-up on the last two questions. It sounds like context is really, really key to your work. Did you find, was there much literature on context and various contexts and how the different structures that kind of underpin different sporting contexts that you were looking at?
Quite limited. So it's still pretty early, but I think that's definitely where it goes next, is saying, okay, well, these are responses in this circumstance, but then I guess creating a bigger picture of what happens in other circumstances or other training contexts would be great. So 100%. I think there's heaps of room for that, but no, in terms of currently, there was very limited, work to work with in that space at the moment.
Cheers.
So I'm really interested in your one person that was so strong, and you ended up giving him a priming load that was really, in absolute terms, very high.
Yeah.
And that was a really bad result. So, I think sometimes it's difficult sometimes to use a sort of standard figure across all people because, some people can do a lot of reps at a quite high percentage of their 1RM and other people can't do nearly so many. And so, I think that's trying to come up with it's almost like an individual thing that you need to sort of experiment with rather than trying to come up with a single figure, percentage of 1RM that you apply to everybody.
Like a receptivity to priming.
Yeah, 100%. No, I agree. And it might even be other methods of prescribing as well, Alan. Like it might be either feel or using velocity or some other sort of measure to help guide the coach and the athlete to figuring out maybe what works best for them.
Yeah, I think you obviously had enough to do in your PhD, but
it's huge.
if you would have been able to kind of characterize some of the physiological characteristics, you know what I mean, of your participants, and you might have helped you kind of understand those individual responses. But yeah, it's not always possible to do that for every single study. So yeah.
If you go into academia, you can supervise someone else to do that for you.
Yeah. I still find it super interesting. Yeah. So there's plenty more room in space.
Yeah.